list. I think that every single one of us, to some degree or another, have issues about feeling we need to be in control. And there's something right about that, because we all need to be able to make our own choices without undue pressure from anyone else. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about attempting to control situations and other people without even knowing we're doing it sometimes. And refusing to relinquish control means we're not really trusting God to act. It's when we feel we've got to do something or nothing will happen. Sometimes it means having strong convictions we know best, doing the first thing that enters our head without even considering God or consulting him. And I believe we have a job relinquishing control because we fear God will do nothing, as I've said, especially if a situation is long-standing, deep-rooted, and has become normal to us. We just get weary of the journey. We aren't prepared to wait any longer. We feel he's not engaged in our situation because he's only interested in promoting the gospel. That's what we think. Our problems are irrelevant for him, too messy, perhaps, for a holy God. We can also feel he just doesn't do big stuff anymore. And isn't it selfish anyway to be seeking God about our own problems when we can always see that someone else is worse off than us? Of course, we don't always put those thoughts into words. They can be subconscious or dismissed because we don't actually want to own them. Could we have the second picture, Louise? What we do often say is, God is in control. However, I think that statement needs some thinking about. Now, it's absolutely true. God has unlimited power. Nothing and no one can stand against him, fool him, or ultimately thwart his purposes. The cross teaches us that in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8, when it says that the enemy would never have crucified the Lord of glory had he understood what was really going on. The scripture, all things work together for good, in Romans 8:28 teaches us that. As to scriptures like Numbers 11:28, Isaiah 50, verse 2, and stories like Esther and Gideon, or Paul's adventures in the book of Acts. But actually, God is not in full control of human affairs, not directly. Now, I know that sounds odd, but when we think about it, God gave control of this earth to us. Genesis 1:28, and there are other scriptures about that. Now, there are plenty to declare the earth belongs to God, but we've been given authority to manage it. In Genesis 6:5, 6:11, and 12, we see God grieving the sinfulness of man on the earth, but he never takes back the power he's given to mankind. If God had absolute control in our world, no one would be hungry. No one would suffer violence. Wars, floods, fires, famines would all cease. Heaven's like that. It's in heaven his will is always done. And we speak that every time we say the Lord's Prayer. We say, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Prayer and practical action work because God requires human involvement and consent to achieve anything on earth. God gave us authority, and that's why Jesus could only bring about salvation by taking on a human body, by becoming one of us, the second Adam. He, the Word, had to become flesh and dwell among us. It needed a man to make perfect atonement, but no man was found, it says in Isaiah 59, verse 16. The only man fit for a task was a man who was also God, selfless enough to leave heaven and suffer untold agonies so we don't have to. But Jesus' coming did not save anyone automatically. We still have control over us, the choice to accept his solution or not. Now, it's true he had to draw you and work on you, and without that, you couldn't have chosen him. He's constantly working to draw people to himself, but he never ever forces. The heart of the matter is, God could control us like robots. He has the power to do it, but he chooses not to. He's great, but his greatness is expressed not in control, but in overwhelming love. The love is meant to win us so that we'll gradually relinquish control of our own lives and invite him in without fear. The world desperately needs changing, but God, for all his greatness, will only change it one consented life at a time, which can be frustrating at times for us, can't it? Of course, he does everything he can. He makes use of situations. He puts people in the right place at the right time. He puts thoughts in our minds and hearts. He'll manipulate circumstances, exercise protection. He inspires ministries and even unbelievers to go out and do good. He still can do miracles and healings. He carries on making his word, which is spirit, flesh, through us. Now, if God resists from controlling us, we have to understand we've no right to try and control other people's inner lives and choices. That can be difficult for parents to learn about children. Been there. It can be difficult for anyone in any relationship. We all have to learn we've each got full control over one thing, and that's ourselves. And hopefully, bit by bit, we can choose to yield more of that to God. So, where am I going with this? I want to bring my title to something practical. That is, when we are confronted by a situation or person that needs to change, that's when we want God's greatness to manifest by seeing him do something. That's when we grapple with whether he will or whether he can. That's when we may try and take control ourselves, especially when we grow weary of the journey and maybe doubt God will ever help us finally resolve our difficulties. I want to present 3 strategies to help us yield control to God, which will strengthen us to persevere in our journeys toward resolution of whatever we're facing. Could we have number 3, Lorraine? These strategies are: 1, magnify the Lord, not the problem. Worshipping to change our perspective, and crucially, at each little victory on the way. 2 is meditate on the overwhelming greatness and goodness of God and get a revelation by speaking it. The Hebrew word for meditate is mutter. To do that before you see the answer. And 3 is asking God to change your own heart as a first step to changing a person or situation you're dealing with. And that is the hardest. That's often in direct opposition to our feelings and certainly in opposition to the wisdom of this world. For 1 and 2, I'm mainly using scriptures. For 3, I'm using an example from the recent past of some friends of ours who've given permission for me just to share some of their experience. So, number 1 is magnify the Lord at each small victory on your journey. That can be difficult when you're impatient for the end result. David understood this. In Psalm 34, he encourages his men to magnify the Lord. Magnify in Hebrew means to ascribe goodness and greatness to God. It's used many times, especially in the Psalms. And of course, Mary uses it in Luke 1:46, when the angel appears to her. It implies a drawing near to see more clearly and to worship. So how do you magnify the Lord? You deliberately change your focus. You focus on who God is rather than the problems. Whatever you focus on gets bigger in your eyes. Magnifying God's like looking at him in a magnifying mirror. I've got one, and thankfully it doesn't make my face any bigger in reality, but it certainly helps me to see more clearly. Focus on the problems, and it's easy to be overwhelmed. But here's the crucial point I want to make about this psalm. It celebrates a victory and deliverance. If you read it, you'd think David's troubles were all over, but not so. He certainly had been delivered from Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, and had found refuge in the cage of Adullam. And there many desperate men joined him who were all outcasts like himself. Despite escaping the Philistines, David was still homeless and in exile. Saul was still determined to kill him and would continue to hunt him down. He had years of trouble ahead. Yet David magnified the Lord for that victory. He celebrated it as if it were the final one. Verse 6 says, "This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles." And in verse 17, "When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles." Isn't that an encouragement to mark each small victory on our journeys too? And let's look at the alternative. It would have been so easy for David to magnify his problems and focus on those. He could have been overwhelmed with self-pity, with the relentlessness of Saul and his absolute power as king, with the hopelessness of his situation. God had caused Samuel to anoint David as king, and yet here he was, a fugitive in danger of his life, no apparent way out, sleeping rough, and with an uninvited band of wanted men. Saul had almost killed David several times. David could so easily have felt abandoned by God, got tired of waiting, lost hope, and taken matters into his own hands. He could have drummed up support and tried to take power, just like Absalom, his son, tried to do years later. He even got the chance to kill Saul when Saul entered a cave he was hiding in. You can read about that in 1 Samuel 24. He could easily have justified the murder as self-defense or because God had declared him king. So often, when we don't magnify and worship the Lord, we get fed up waiting and can take matters into our own hands. Saul did that many times, and especially in 1 Samuel 13. That's when Saul was awaiting Samuel to make sacrifice because the Philistines were after the Israelites and they were under pressure. When Samuel was late, Saul didn't magnify the Lord. He focused on the problem, took matters into his own hands, and made the sacrifices himself. That cost him kingship. That cost him having his descendants remain on the throne. And when Samuel challenged him, instead of humbling himself, he justified himself. So there's a pattern there. Magnify the problem, be overwhelmed, become impatient with God's timing, lose hope, take matters into your own hands, do something inappropriate, find a way to justify it. I think we've probably all been there to one degree or another. But David chose to magnify the Lord at each small victory, trusting God would finally bring about a final deliverance. Because of this, his perception of God's greatness was magnified and grew bigger. We can all feel as if our problems are bigger than God. If we will just turn to him, magnify him, submit to him, he'll bring us through in the end. And even at final deliverance, add blessings and restore the years the locust has eaten, as it says in Joel 2:25. We see David express confidence in God again and again, despite near despair and horrendous circumstances at times. And each time we see his level of confidence in God return and grow. Number 2 is meditating on the overwhelming goodness of God. Again, David was the expert on this, and it always blows my mind. He had such a clear revelation of the goodness and loving kindness of God, even though he was under the old covenant. He understood what the new would bring. He says, "Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity." And that refers to us, not to David. In David's day, iniquity was certainly imputed to each and every one because Jesus hadn't come yet. Sacrifices to atone for sin were constant and temporary. If you read the Old Testament, you'll see how onerous it all was. We know none of us can keep the moral law because we sin inwardly, not just outwardly. But the procedures and ceremonies were detailed and unrelenting day after day after day, reminding us how huge, how all-encompassing the work of Jesus had to be. It must have been terrifying living under the law. You either fooled yourself you could keep it, like the Pharisees, or you rebelled, gave up, or you cried out to God. But David always saw the true nature of God and saw how God longed to display his loving kindness in Jesus. He deliberately state again and again how good God is, and that was meditating on it, because as I said, meditate means to mutter under your breath. Speaking is much more powerful than thinking. As in Psalm 91, it says, "I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress." There's loads of statements about God's loving kindness again and again in the Psalms and in many other places, despite the Old Covenant. And the more we meditate and mutter and speak God's goodness, the easier revelation will come, and we'll sense that God will bring resolution in the end. It might look bad now. It might look as though he's forgotten us. It might look like weapons formed against us will prosper, even though in Isaiah 54 it says they won't. But if we'll just declare God's goodness regularly, we can grasp that he is for us, not against us. And I'm learning to be happy with that. Declaring truth out loud is important. Scriptures tell us that even God speaks the things that are not before they are, in Isaiah 46:10. In the natural, we're like Thomas in John 20:29. We want to see before we believe. For in God's kingdom, we believe in our hearts before we see, and speak our faith before we see, like in Hebrews 11. It can take time, but speaking our faith each day is powerful. I think I've told you before that our greyhound, Cassie, when she was 10, showed signs of incontinence, and how I started to speak faith over her because I was determined not to lose her at 10 years old. It went on a few months and there was a little bit of improvement, and I got discouraged and started to think, oh, I'm just being stupid, I'm wasting my time here. But God spoke to me and said, don't give up. It's just around the corner. And within 2 weeks, she was sound. And the amazing thing was that a good few years later, when she got pancreatitis, the vet said the test revealed she'd got the kidneys of a much younger dog, and that there was nothing wrong with her waterworks. And certainly there hadn't been. And that's just a small example, really, of how powerful speaking your faith can be. Of course, we can't earn it by speaking. Everything we need has been provided at the cross. We just cooperate with what God's already done to be part of the process as each victory enters the natural world. It's that human cooperation again that God needs to bring about his kingdom, magnifying him, meditating on his goodness. It helps give him control as we give him control. Strategy number 3 is the hardest. allowing God to change our hearts as a first step to changing a person or situation. Well, this is tricky. We want God to be in control, but are we really willing to give him control of us? Especially if we think it's totally the other person that needs changing. This requires humility, and accepting God's opinion may be different than our own. I've permission to share the following from some friends. The names I will use, Beth and Tom, are not their real names. Beth made contact with me a little while back and asked to talk to me, though we'd only mostly kept in touch at Christmas and birthdays. She said it wouldn't be a one-off and might need support over a period of time, and could I commit to that? And she said she was devastated. I said yes. And she told me her discovery that her husband of many years had a long-standing problem with pornography. Strangely enough, I'd already begun to research the effects of pornography. I'd heard a news report about young girls being harassed at school. The report had intrigued me because when I was young, that rarely happened, even though in the 50s and 60s, women were presented in mainstream media very differently than today. I mean, if you watch the two Ronnies, for example, you'll cringe sometimes at some of the way they present women. But to me, it seems strange that girls weren't harassed then, but are now, in a world where we imagine women have more recognition and respect. It wasn't like me to read up on a big social issue, but for some reason I'd felt compelled. I'd even talked about it to my ID group. I read books by Christians and non-Christians and read research online. It seems concern has arisen at how widespread this hidden problem is, even among Christian men. I was disturbed and unsettled to read how porn culture has changed itself and become more toxic, horrified at how easily it's available on the internet, appalled by the lies, the message that it's imparting about women and relationship, saddened by the devastating side effects it has on long-term users. The fact is, it can be an addiction, every bit as powerful as drugs or alcohol. And even if it doesn't, it still physically rewires the brain in ways that damage the user and then those around them. I became alarmed that young people can be sucked in so deep, so quickly. They become incapable of building meaningful relationships because it distorts concepts of reality without people realizing. And because what was once hard content and difficult to get is now quite normal. It seems I was being prepared to support my friend. I can't tell you too much about their journey, but I do want to tell you a few weeks back that God spoke something remarkable to Beth. For a bit of backstory first. Her whole world, she told me, had seemed to cave. She felt that what she knew as truth, her marriage and been the love of Tom's life, had been a lie. She felt stupid and gullible. She felt betrayed, rejected, discarded, dirty, full of hopelessness, grief and anger. She was angry with the perpetrators as well as with Tom. She felt these women were betraying their own kind by stealing away real-life relationships and substituting a web of lies. When she first spoke to me, she hadn't approached Tom because she felt she needed time to process, and she wasn't sure that as yet she could extend forgiveness and unconditional love toward him. We cried a lot. She understands she's a forgiven person, like you and I, and she knew that bawling him out would actually do no good. She told me that she saw Jesus offered, "Neither do I condemn you," to the woman caught in adultery before he said, "Go and sin no more." But she was afraid. Unconditional was a risk. What if Tom was unrepentant? What would they do then? Where would they go? Thankfully, Tom was repentant. He was absolutely gutted. He assured her of his love, and they have begun to explore a new level of honesty with each other, and they've begun to rebuild their relationship. They're equally committed to saving their marriage. But one night, God spoke something to Beth that struck me as amazing and has helped move things forward. Something to magnify the Lord for, a victory on the journey, if you like, before reaching the final destination, just like David. Beth was in a time of grieving again, and God said, Beth, do not be a victim. You are mine. You are royal. Are you ready for some warfare? And she said yes, expecting the Lord wanted her to pray more. Then God said, how about you let me change your heart? How about you let me inspire you so you can become the best possible wife you can be? Let's overcome evil with good. And Beth told me that at that moment, she'd felt some of her pain drain away as she saw God's way forward. She felt his love for Tom and hers too rise up inside of her afresh. She was imbued with a new desire to get up and fight, to fight for her husband, to fight for her marriage, even though she felt so small against $1 billion industry. She could have rejected God's plan, but was humble enough to understand that though she'd not been a bad wife, there was still plenty God could teach her. She could have felt he was being unfair. It should be Tom doing all the changing. But she understood that the alternative, constantly making him feel bad or demanding he make it up to her all the time or remaining a victim, would be toxic to their marriage, not healing. And how much their renewed relationship means to them both. She saw the genius of God's plan. She knew that Tom would love it. She was not in control of his choices, nor had she ever been, but God was in control of her. It was a pivotal moment and crucial to having renewed vigor for the journey. And it struck me, I was so humbled, and it just struck me, so often it's God's principle when something needs changing to actually begin with us. I think that's challenging, but really inspiring. Can we have picture 4, Lorraine? Because in a moment, we're going to play a song so that God can minister to every one of us. Maybe there's a situation or person you need God to change. You want his greatness to take control. Maybe you need to magnify and worship the Lord at each little step of progress, like David did, like my friend learnt to do. Maybe you've lost touch with faith in God's goodness. Maybe the journey has just felt too long. Maybe you need to read about God's goodness, meditate on it and speak it until you see that he's still with you, and he'll be with you all the way through. Maybe God wants to change you, to work in you as a first step in changing a person or situation, not because you've been bad, but just because he can. He can always do more in our lives than he's already done. Are you ready to relinquish the feeling that you've been unfairly treated and let him work that in you? Are you ready to help him overcome evil with good? Maybe you're not in that situation at all. Maybe you just need to hear God affirm that he loves you, because as was said earlier, we need to hear that every single day. Maybe you just need to hear him say, I love you, that he's with you in all you do. Because whether you're on a journey or not, God wants to minister today. Amen. Yeah.